Hi, and welcome to Check Your Thread, a podcast about sewing more sustainably. My name's Zoe, and I'm obsessed with sewing. I've been blogging about it for over 13 years and am the creator and host of the popular handmade wardrobe challenge, Me Made May. But like many people, I've become increasingly concerned about the climate crisis and the way my lifestyle contributes to it. So in this podcast, I'll be nerding out about making clothes whilst exploring how to minimise the negative impact that it may have. I really hope you'll join me on this journey. Hello, Check Your Threadheads! Are you well? I very much hope so. I've been feeling a bit stressed over the last week or so, feeling that I've just had too many tasks piling on top of me. But some of those are dealt with now, so I'm feeling a little bit better. It's all good. So, quick announcement. If you live in Sussex in the UK, or you can get to the Hove Portslade area of Sussex on Sunday the 13th of March, I'm organising a fabric and pattern swap as a fundraiser for Ukraine. So at time of recording, the details are still being finalised, but please keep an eye on my blog, Sozo What Do You Know, or my personal Instagram feed at SozoBlog, and at the Check Your Thread Instagram feed at Check Your Thread, if you're interested in learning more to help us raise money for this important cause. Plus, it should be a super fun way to offload some fabric and patterns that you no longer want and pick up some that you do. Right, so how's your making gone this week? My sewing time over the last week was hijacked by preparing for World Book Day. So a bit of background about World Book Day if it's not something that's generally celebrated where you live. So here, a lot of schools in the UK encourage kids to dress up as characters from books that they enjoy. Plus they bring in their favourite books. Sometimes they have like a second-hand book sale and stuff, things like that. So my school decided pretty last minute that they were going to allow dressing up this year. So it was a bit of a stress getting prepared for it. So as you can probably guess, I was committed to buying as little new stuff for it as possible for this endeavour. So we agreed that my son would dress up as Charlie from the Charlie and Lola books. So I decided to make him the Charlie t-shirt that Charlie wears throughout the books. So I had a plain white t-shirt that we had knocking about. Plus I bought a blue t-shirt for £1 from a charity shop for the sleeves. Plus I used my Bobbin Hood screen printing kit and made this like little replica of Charlie's t-shirt. Frankie wore that with jeans and trainers and he was very happy about it and looks very cute. Lola wanted to be Mildred Hubble from the Worst Witch series. We already had like a plain white school shirt and dark grey pinafore, plus a tie and some boots that we sprayed black. In addition to those, we got a long grey skirt from a charity shop, which I refitted, which she wore over the top of the pinafore to make it look long. And I got a black satin pillowcase from the charity shop, which became a cape. I already had some red fabric scraps, which I made into a sash. And Lola made herself a broom from a bamboo cane and some paper, and she made herself a cat using paper and paper tape and a pen, which was very, very cute. And we borrowed a witch's hat from a classmate. I've put pictures of both of those on my @SozoBlog Instagram account if you want to have a little visual. I feel a tiny bit guilty about buying up items to cut up that someone else could have used in their current form. But the blue t-shirt at least was pretty grotty in the underarm area, so I don't feel too bad about that. So I'm counting those costumes as my sustainability win for the week also. This week I get to thank Deborah and Linda who have signed up via Patreon to support the podcast. I really appreciate you both, as I do all the patrons of course. If you'd like to help keep this ship afloat, please find out more via the link in the show notes or through the website checkyourthread.com. Right, time for me to introduce this week's episode. Oh my goodness, you are in for a treat. It's a particularly lengthy one this week, so if you don't have 1 hour, 20 minutes or so to spare in a row, please listen and then press pause and then come back to it when you can because it really does deserve your attention. I got to talk with textile activist Shams Eldin Rogers, who splits her time between Toronto, Canada and Vermont in the US. I'd definitely say that this was the most powerful and thought-provoking conversation that I've had for the podcast to date. I even ended up crying a couple of times. We got into many important topics, including altering patterns of consumption, her experience as a black maker, active allyship, mending as a political act, making for those with limited resources, and much more. Shams was so incredibly open and honest and generous. This conversation has had a big impact on me, and I've honestly been thinking about it ever since it happened. There was more of this conversation that I just couldn't cram into this already pretty long episode, so I'll put the rest together for another episode at some point in the future. So if you enjoy this, know that there is another dose of Shams wisdom coming along at some point. So as always, please check out the show notes for links to all the things that we talked about. All right, let's get into it.
So, okay, I'm ready.
Okay, right. Well, thank you so much once again for doing this. Thank you for giving me some of your weekend as well. I really appreciate that.
You're very welcome.
So if you wouldn't mind, can you let us know a bit more about yourself? Could you tell us who you are, where you are, and what fills your days?
I am Shamsuddin Rogers, and I live in Montpelier, Vermont, in the United States, and Toronto, Ontario, Canada.
Right, where are you right now?
I'm in Canada. And recently I have started teaching third grade French immersion.
Oh.
So that is filling my days. I've been a teacher for, I guess, a quarter century now, maybe a little bit more. And for the past few years, though, I hadn't been teaching. I'd been spending full time on my sewing and my mending. And also that gave me the opportunity to start educating in different ways. So I began to teach through Creative Reuse Toronto.
Oh, what's that?
It is an organization devoted to helping people find ways to keep things from going into the landfill. And a lot of what we are doing is textiles. So I was teaching knitting with t-shirt strips and
really?
upcycling clothing. Yes. And I also started making masks in the beginning of the pandemic and getting into communication with other people, and made, together with my team, 1,200 masks, or more than 1,200 masks. All of those masks were for marginalized groups and for charity. And some people then wanted to do a profile of me on Instagram and talk about my mask making. And I really wasn't familiar with Instagram at that point. So we're saying early in the May, June 2020 was when I said, okay, you're profiling me. Let me find out what that's about. And since then, I began to post more and more and to try to use the platform of Instagram as a place to educate people about textiles, about how we can live more environmentally safely with textiles, from the production, from the use and mending, and then the eventual disposal of textiles. So I've been using my teaching skills and background, as well as background in teaching economics, as kind of support for my work in spreading this to people. And I don't plan on stopping now that I've returned to full-time employment in the schools.
That's good. I'd like
to continue. Yes, I'm going to continue.
So I discovered your feed a few months ago, and I just love it so much. You write such interesting, thoughtful and thought-provoking things about textiles, about the reuse and use and mending and stuff. And it always makes me think, and you always have some really interesting stuff on there. So I'm so glad that you're not planning on stepping away from that.
Not at all. I think it's very important when we talk about any kind of activism that we want to have. What is the goal of your activism?
Yeah.
The goal has to be specific and understood by the person who's doing who is the activist, but also you need to be able to articulate that clearly to other people. Activists want to bring about some change. I would like for people to first stop buying things that they don't want, and to understand what it means, so they know what they do and don't want, to understand the implications of the various things they're buying. So that needs education. Then, after they have that education, I would like them to treat their clothes in ways that are better for themselves and the planet, and for their budgets and for their communities. Again, they need education for that.
Yeah, there's a lot of unlearning your own habits as well in that, isn't there?
There is, depending on how you've been brought up. I'm noticing that there are people in some parts of the world who are already living in a very ecological way with their textiles without that necessarily having been brought to their attention. Yeah. They are saying, oh, it's expensive to buy these textiles. It's difficult to make them. I need to take care of them. There are communities where tailors are a part of your regular existence.
Yeah.
In Romania, for example, in Sibiu, Romania, where I spent a year teaching, I saw that there were stores where you could buy new clothes, but there were also tailors throughout the town. And many people believed that the best way for them to get clothes would be to go to their tailor. They would go and choose their fabric. They would go to their tailor. I've seen this in Egypt. I saw this in Abu Dhabi. I've heard that it exists in Senegal. I've heard that it exists in Kenya, that there are still communities where the idea of knowing who made your clothes is alive.
Yeah.
There are also still communities where repair and mending of your clothes, of your shoes, of your home textiles, and your other things in your life are active parts of their lives. So when we talk about rethinking, that is from a perspective of a certain type of privilege in certain types of countries and situations
Sure.
where I had the good luck to go to Egypt at a young age. I was 19 when I first went to Egypt to study. And it was there that I began to see, oh, there's another way. Sure,
Right.
my parents were already thrifty and they already went secondhand shopping, and my mom mended things by hand. But it was in Egypt that I saw people really seriously say, what do you mean one hole is a problem? What, we're going to find some way to weave that. Egyptians are very proud about their public clothing. So anything they're wearing that people can see, if it's mended, they will have done invisible mending and
Right.
weaving. For their interior clothes, their pajamas, their underwear, they're mending those, and it would be more obvious that it's been mended.
Right.
And they're mending and remending and remending it because that's money
Yeah.
that has to go out. And so they have that concept. So I learned that to be able to, as I grew older, incorporate some of those lessons.
Fantastic. Fantastic. I'm going to definitely come back to all of that. I'm going to put about 10 pins in everything you just said.
Okay.
So I saw in your bio and your Instagram feed that you describe yourself as a textile activist, which is such a good term. So that kind of informs everything that you're doing. As you said, you're kind of setting out your goal as a textile activist on Instagram. That's really powerful. So how do you see your textile activism in your day-to-day?
When I was teaching, and again, now that I'm teaching, I specifically include discussion of textiles in all of the lessons that I'm teaching.
Fantastic.
When I was teaching economics, I would talk about your choice, and I would think about, oh, if you have a sheep, are you going to kill it and eat it? Are you going to raise it and harvest its wool and make things for your family? You may need to make different choices at different times in your life, depending on your circumstance. Now that I'm teaching the third grade, those children are about to be exposed to knitting with wool in the Waldorf fashion. I wasn't trained at Waldorf, but I've read some of their lesson plans and see what they're doing and why they think it's important for young children to get involved in knitting. I've taught knitting to many students over the years, and we find that they develop a better understanding of what it takes to create textiles.
Brilliant. I love that you're doing that with younger children.
You have to do it wherever you can. And we're talking about an activism that isn't very controversial.
It's true.
You know, perhaps in a textile producing area, there might be some pushback from people who say, no, we want more. But where I have been in North America, the idea that we need to waste less is appreciated by the community. Whether or not they individually do that, it's appreciated by the community.
Yeah.
It's appreciated by your colleagues and the school board and people to say, people feel bad that they have these huge garbage bags of clothes that they don't want anymore. And they try to find ways to donate them and get rid of them. If we can find ways to help them understand that we can reduce that by our purchasing and use, people are happy with that.
Yeah.
And I think that's important, especially if you're going to do activism that involves children. You don't want the community focusing on the activism instead of its goal.
Yeah.
So for this sort of activism, again, it's supported by the people.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, it's kind of subtle, isn't it? Subtle activism. Like, let's just start. Let's do a craft project. It's fun.
And some people are concerned. There are foundations such as the OR Foundation.
What's that?
This is a foundation that works with vendors in Kantamanto, Ghana. And they are trying to change policies so that people from the developed countries aren't selling huge bales of clothing to Ghana, which is then often unsaleable and then pollutes their water and pollutes their air, pollutes their land.
Yeah.
So they are doing a kind of an activism that is asking there to be broad scale change.
Oh, yes. I heard a very powerful episode of the Wardrobe Crisis podcast with, I've forgotten the name of the lady who does a lot of activism. I think she works for the OR organization, does a lot of work in Kantamanto. Yeah, it was so powerful. I'll put a link in the show notes if everyone wants to.
There's also Thick Present,
Right.
working in, I believe, Belgium or the Netherlands. They are trying to get governments to require companies to have take-back plans for their sold goods.
Right.
So that's also an activist group, and they are attempting to change policy, as well as, of course, to influence people to do things differently. So those are different kinds of activism. I would like to see more cities fund places like the Creative Reuse Center. We got a grant at one point from the City of Toronto Solid Waste Department because we were teaching people how to reduce their landfill.
Yeah.
And I imagine we'll get continued grants from that once we're able to produce again. And I'd like to, in general, encourage people to mimic this in their own cities. It costs money to operate these landfills. So if municipalities and other governmental organizations can support efforts to reduce the landfills, that helps the society in more than one way. Another practice that I certainly support is in Vermont, you have to pay to have your garbage taken away.
Oh.
So there's no city service coming to you to pick up your garbage.
Right.
You have to pay a private company to come and do that, or you have to haul it to the dump yourself,
Right.
where you're charged by the pound.
Oh, really?
And this has been very effective. People try to mend. Again, not everybody has the same ability, but people try hard to mend.
Yeah.
People donate and make free piles on their lawns with signs that are free. The churches, which have the rummage sales, have very cheap prices, and then on the third day, it's $1 per bag. They don't want to throw it away either, right? They don't want to pay to throw it away. So then $1 a bag, and it could be any bag, including an IKEA bag, and you just go there. The food co-op near us in Montpelier, Vermont, just says, come and bring stuff and come and take stuff. We don't care that it's not a swap. It's not a one-for-one. Bring everything you want and take everything you want. A local university does this on a more grand scale. They have you all bring it on one day. They arrange it on the tables, make sure it's clean that they're putting out. And you come back the next day and take whatever you want. Because everybody has the same goal. Nobody wants to pay by the pound.
Yeah.
Jeans weigh a lot.
Yeah.
You don't want to put a pair of jeans into your garbage.
Yeah.
So this really affects the behavior of the citizens.
That feels radical. That feels bold.
I don't know how long they've been doing that in Vermont, but it isn't something replicable in Toronto, for example, because in Vermont, you have much less population density. So people often can, and now the law is you have to compost. You can't put any food scraps in the garbage, even though you're paying for it.
Right.
You have to compost. So people often have enough land to do it.
I was going to say it'd be harder if you're in the city, more built up, don't have any access to space. Yeah.
Exactly. And if you're going to tell people in a city that they have to pay for garbage, and if they can't afford to pay for garbage, it's going to become a public health issue.
Yeah.
So this has to be based on rural or semi-rural lifestyles.
Yeah.
In Montpelier, Vermont, which is the capital, there's fewer than 7,000 people living. That's the capital of one of the 50 states. There are people who live in apartments. They can't compost their own garbage. And then there's a company coming around with horses to these more dense neighborhoods in Montpelier. Again, I'm saying more dense in Montpelier. We're still not saying dense.
It's comparable,
yeah. So the people go out and share communal barrels.
Right.
And put their compost in there, and then the people come along with the horses, and because they don't want to use fossil fuels, and then they take your compost and take it away and give a clean barrel there.
This is amazing.
I think it's wonderful. In our neighborhood, there's even less density, and it's still in the city, mind you, but there's even less density.
Yeah.
So you would be able to compost in your backyard, which we do. They have different solutions depending on their needs. Toronto has municipal composting, and you put things out there, including dog poop, including napkins, paper towels, sanitary products, diapers. All these things go into the compost, and it has the special hot composting.
I was going to say, the industrial composting.
And it can kill all those bacteria, and it has machines to make the plastic fluff up and get sucked out in the other direction. Because when you're putting in those sanitary napkins, for example, there's a lot of plastic in that. And so they separate that mechanically, and it fluffs up with their power equipment. Because remember, this is a huge city. There's millions and millions of people.
Yeah, but think of all that waste being diverted from landfill is incredible.
Right. And of course, there are people, not just me, involved in diverting waste from landfill in all of these cities. And you have movements for zero waste, and in the French parts of Canada, zéro déchet. And you have people talking and sharing and networking and having solutions to try to do this. You have support from the government, and you have support from a growing number of citizens.
Yeah, it sounds like you're very plugged into what's going on in both your homes. It's really exciting.
Well, I really think it's lovely to be part of the world. We have had over the last 2 years an opportunity to see how much we miss when we're not with other people. But at the same time, improvements in technology have brought us to the point that we are able to communicate, you and I right now, from across an ocean in a live recording that should then be able to be disseminated to other people through the
Yeah.
podcast. So we need other people. We were built to be part of communities. And I'm excited by the fact that I can be part of 2 living communities that I can physically visit,
Yeah.
as well as international community of people concerned about the environment.
Agreed. I feel so lucky. I've been doing a lot of research and thinking about the kind of make, do, and mend era in the 1940s
Mm-hmm.
at the moment, and thinking about the way that community was so important during that time, but how different it is to now, and how we are so lucky that we can have this conversation. I can have this conversation with you. I'm not limited to the people that are around, my physical space, and the fact that I can get to talk to you. I can learn about those ideas and the things that are going on. I'm not restricted to if someone in a newspaper decided to write an article on it.
Mm-hmm.
It's really cool. So let's talk about mending, because you have said on your feed that mending is your favorite type of sewing. So that's very exciting.
Absolutely.
So can you let us know any early experiences you've had of mending, and do you have any idea of when mending started to take on a more kind of political dimension for you?
Well, so my early experiences, I don't even remember how old I was. My mother had one of those cookie tins with the needles and thread inside, as is so common. And if a button came off of something or there was a rip in something, she would take out and fix that. She didn't necessarily teach me politically to focus on mending, but both of my parents were leftists. They were concerned about conditions in what was then called the Third World, and concerned about oppressed peoples in the First and Second World. And that consciousness was something that we often discussed. And my parents would say, when it's time to make a decision, you need to think about what the effect will be on the people with the fewest resources. My mother would quote the Bible and quote that Jesus said, "What you do for the least of these, you do for me." And that was very much a part of the way my parents saw the world.
Right.
I didn't think about that in terms of mending. I'd say, I think the mask movement politicized my concern a great deal more. When the pandemic first happened, my father was very ill. He was moving to the end of his life, and I could not travel to Georgia in the United States to be with him. We knew he wouldn't have wanted me to risk getting sick. We also didn't know how people were getting sick.
Yeah.
So people then at that time were sending me messages and saying, "Will you make masks?" People are joining together and making masks. And I, of course, had no ability to join them in that. But when he passed, in fact, the day of the funeral, I began to make masks.
Right.
And I began to make masks sometimes out of scraps. And I know that it takes resources to make these masks. The fabric, the labor, the know-how, and that costs money.
Yeah.
I did not want to sell masks. I wanted to donate my fabric and labor and money. And the other people in Creative Reuse Toronto wanted to do the same thing. I therefore didn't want to give the masks to hospitals,
Right,
which could have paid someone else. There are makers in Toronto making masks for $10 or $15. Hospitals can pay for someone to make the masks. I wanted to, and my friends also wanted to, give those masks to people who didn't have access otherwise to the PPE. They called it the personal protective equipment at that time. So there are people refugees living in shelters. At that time, they had no way to protect themselves from this in their communities, from this deadly disease. And I wanted to use my labors toward them. I didn't want to use my labor toward already privileged people. And as I grew from that, and the demand for masks diminished in a few months, the Canadian government was able to source sufficient PPE for everyone that needed it and supply it through the market or through non-market mechanisms such as charitable organizations. But now I've got this urge to think about the members of society who are often going without.
Yeah.
So then began to do more making for the public. Already before the pandemic, I was turning old t-shirts into grocery bags and donating to a nearby food shelf, but I began doing that more. And once you've taken an old t-shirt and transformed it, that's not mending, that's upcycling. But our next step is, what about the things that we can fix that don't have to be cut up? And so that's where I went with the mending as a political question. It's a political question also because you're challenging the status quo. You're challenging, in my case, the Black bourgeois upbringing. Again, I had leftist parents, so it wasn't exactly the same as other members of the Black bourgeoisie, but the idea that we should have stuff, that we should celebrate by getting more stuff, that every time we have an Easter or we have a Christmas or we have a somebody's birthday or we have a back to school, that we need more stuff. The way that we have related to stuff as a Black community, as a marginalized community in North America, has been different than the way the mainstream has responded to it, but it still results in stuff.
Right.
And to say to people, including myself, you don't need any more stuff. The stuff you have can be saved, can be restyled, can be repaired, and you can change your consumption patterns. Also, historically, we have been under-resourced in terms of our finances. Even though I'm speaking of the bourgeoisie, who have a higher income than the Black people writ large, we still have a lower net worth than white Americans of our same income levels.
Right.
What if we would turn some of our spending into more investment if we have changed our ideas about our consumption of, among other things, textiles? So this has become a very political question to me. I don't always say on my posts that I'm talking about a political concern as a member of a community, but I do make sure to tag them Black Makers Matter. I make sure to offer things that would be, I think, of interest to our community as well. Sometimes it's rather radical to talk about, let's say, sanitary pads that you've made and are reusing, you're washing and reusing, and trying to introduce those. But this is working. Our community is changing and growing, and I see more Black menders and upcyclers on Instagram and Facebook and the YouTube. And I heard that they're on TikTok. I'm not real good at the TikTok yet, but I see more and more. And it doesn't mean I don't care about everybody in the world. I certainly do. But I can speak to my own community, I think, more effectively.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you for sharing that. So when I first discovered your Instagram feed, it was around the time that you were writing a lot of really beautiful posts about using and reusing your late father's clothes. And I found that those were really, really powerful and really beautiful, those posts. And you've said that you were happy for me to talk about that.
Yes.
So clothes, they're probably some of like the most kind of personal possessions that you can have of somebody's, aren't they? So would I be right in assuming that when you were wearing and reusing some of those textiles, it was bringing quite a lot of kind of feelings and memories reusing those?
Well, it's interesting because my mother had already done a good job of sorting through Daddy's belongings that were left at the nursing home and donating a lot of the things that would be most usable. Right. And even when he went into the nursing home, she knew a family with sons in a similar age group who needed the suits and many of the clothes that you might use for jobs and things like that. So by the time I came into the story, because it was more than a year and a half, I guess, before we could be vaccinated, before the CDC in the United States was saying that you could travel if you were fully vaccinated. Once we were fully vaccinated, Mom had already sorted a lot of the things. And so what remained were the things that were more unsuitable for donation.
Right.
The underwear, the socks, the pajamas, the long underwear, a few t-shirts and things that she had saved for me.
Yeah.
So some of these clothes I had made for Daddy.
Oh,
Some
really?
of these boxers, I had made him boxers when I first got my computerized machine in 2007. And I made them out of whatever quilting fabric I could find that was on sale. And I knew that he had a whimsical sense of humor. So, there were Halloween boxers because those were on
Oh.
discount. The fabric was on discount after Halloween.
Yeah.
Christmas boxers, Dayglow boxers. One time a gentleman came to the house where my parents were living in Arizona. He was there to do yard work. And Dad answered the door in a t-shirt and boxers. And he said, "¿Qué diablos ese?" And my father said, "Mi hija me los hizo."
Yay.
And it means my daughter made them for me. And he was very proud
Oh,
of
that's so nice.
Yeah, he was very proud of them. Mom gave me some of them when he first went to the nursing home, and there were still some left. We don't think it's generally appropriate to donate underwear, so I took those boxers back, and I've been wearing them. It turns out they fit.
Yeah.
There was a pair of jeans that he used to wear all the time, that they were so worn out that they couldn't be donated.
Yeah.
I didn't even think those things could fit me. I took the jeans and I took the undies and things just so they wouldn't become landfill.
Yeah.
Then one day I was cold. I was in Vermont and it was supposedly warm weather. I was cold. I didn't have all my warm clothes with me. And then I said, Daddy's long johns, that looks good. That looks warm. And I put them on and they fit. Then I started seeing that everything that I had was fitting, that I was close enough in size,
Yeah.
that those favorite jeans fit, the long underwear, the socks, and I had knitted a lot of the socks as well.
Really?
So those things fit me. And I had seen my father's long underwear maybe once, because I was from a family where you didn't see your parents in states of undress.
Yeah.
So I saw these, I'd seen the boxers because I made them, but
Right.
I hadn't seen them over the years. And then some of these things I'd never seen. I'd seen the long underwear shirt. And so once I posted a picture of myself wearing the long underwear shirt, a follower wrote in and she said that those were produced for the US Army in the 60s and 70s.
Really?
I didn't know where he'd gotten it. I didn't have any idea. So I called my mom and she said, "Yeah, your father had that already when we were married in 1964. He had gone to the U.S. Army Reserves and had served in the U.S. Army Reserves, and I presume that's where he got them. But he had that already when I first started knowing about his clothes. So that was when I started to have more of these feelings of poignancy about the fact that he went. He volunteered to support our country and went to the Army Reserves. He was never sent overseas. At that point, he was in the United States, but he volunteered to serve his country, and they issued him these items. Certainly the shirt was issued from the Army, and then he kept it for more than 50 years.
Wow. And now it's got a life with you.
Now it's got a life with me. So that really does feel special to me. And then to look at the other things with that light, but to say, I made those socks for him with love. Every stitch, I knitted those, and now I'm still wearing them.
Yeah.
We carry our parents with us. I'm tearing up, but I'm not ashamed. I love my father.
Please, yeah.
We carry our parents with us in so many ways. Late in his life with his Alzheimer's, I asked Daddy, "Do you know who I am?" And he said, "You're me. I made you." And he couldn't say, "You're my daughter." But today, I can feel yes. He made me, he and my mother, and they're responsible for starting the stage for me and giving me this I just need to talk about reading for a minute. Again, your
Please.
listeners, most people who have access to podcast technology can also read. But in many countries, people don't have that. And a few people in North America also, people don't read. My parents taught me this at a young age. I was reading, I was 2.5.
Wow.
Yeah. And they taught me how to find things. And they taught me how to compare sources and check whether I trusted. I wouldn't be doing this mending. I don't know what I'd be doing, but I wouldn't be doing these things if I couldn't access the material to learn about it. So also you'll see in some of my posts that I've been helping an Afghan lady.
Yes.
Which is something that, again, my parents would want. My husband is also an activist, and he's done a lot, giving concerts to raise money for refugees and helping refugees. So we're both in support of this. And this lady has lived under war-torn Afghanistan for her whole life. She never had access to schooling. In order for us to teach her to sew, someone has to physically go to her house and teach her. There aren't online YouTube videos in Pashto for her to see. There aren't books that she can read, even in Pashto, because she doesn't read.
Yeah.
So when I want to teach sewing to a friend from a developed situation, I can give them links. I can send them to the blogs. I can send them to the library to get books. They don't need much from me.
Yeah.
They
Just need a
started
nudge.
Right. They started from parents. They started from communities that offer that. Many people were even offered textile education in school, home economics, and so forth. I was extremely fortunate to have been taught and brought up that if I don't know something, go find it out.
Yeah.
If you don't have something, go make it. And so, in wearing my father's clothes, and I wear my mother's clothes because she's still living. When she passes, God knows when that is. Perhaps I'll have gone before. We don't know. But I would expect that I would wear some of those. I made some of those too.
Oh.
But also, I'm using that measuring that they taught me, that use of a tape measure,
Right.
and that belief that nobody stops me. And that, I think, is a rare thing to get. So
Yeah.
when people, and so moving from that a little bit to discussion of the inclusive sewing movement, and
Mm-hmm.
inclusive in terms of size and accessibility, I've never been very excited by the idea that all patterns have to be size inclusive. I'm a big person. I'm wearing a 22, 24 in the US sizes. I've been losing weight, getting closer to a 22, 20. And I recently looked up a review from mine from about 13 years ago where I saw that the pattern company wasn't offering the cute petite patterns in my size. So I made them in my size anyway. I don't feel like the pattern companies are the boss of me.
Right.
I don't feel that the clothing companies are the boss of me. So another Instagrammer was complaining and she also was a very slim woman, but she was saying these stores don't offer alternatives for heavy people.
Right.
I'm of the opinion, why do I need a store? Do I not have scissors and a needle and thread? Do I not have fabric? Why do I care what the stores are doing? And that also is something that came very much from my parents.
Really.
Just if stories in books didn't include us, my parents they didn't use some stories with African American children, such as The Snowy Day was one of our favorites. But also, otherwise, they would just write them in. And they would put a little brown girl and her little brown sister into
Yeah.
the story. They don't have to, it's great that there are more books now. And it is great if they make more patterns for more people. But I wasn't taught to wait for that.
Right.
To make your own stuff. So I started sewing. I started knitting. I think I was 8 years old, started knitting.
Yeah.
And I began to make the patterns fit me automatically. When you're knitting, you're going to make the sleeves the size you want. Oh, you're going to say, oh, next time if I do something different, I'll have more room around the chest. Then I discovered the work of Elizabeth Zimmerman, who was a great knitting author and really in the vanguard of knitting in North America, and to learn more about, yes, you are the boss of your creativity. And I'm like, yes, this is what we want to hear. So I started knitting and putting in the bust dart adjustments and the narrow shoulder adjustments. Then as I began sewing and started to say, why do I need clothes from the store? Who's the store anyway? Who am I supporting? I began to respond to needs for clothing for I should make this or I should try to find it in my closet. So although it's only been, I guess, the last year that I've been saying no new factory clothes, it's been quite a few years since I bought anything other than underwear or turtlenecks or socks from factories because of that attitude of they don't boss us. And my mother used to say quite frequently, slavery days are over. And that would be her response to lots of things. You're at your job. You don't have to keep that job if you don't want to. She did keep her job, but they don't own you. And again, I'm very thankful to both of my parents.
Yeah, that's a wonderful thing to be reminded of. You made me have so many thoughts when you were saying those things. Something that really struck me as you were saying about how you don't feel a kind of slave to patterns. And it really made me think about how when I was really getting into making my own clothes about 20 years ago, more like 15 years ago, like the kind of indie pattern scene was very in its infancy, and there was only like a couple of companies out there that were producing patterns that were the big four, and it was a bit more of a DIY free-for-all kind of vibe, and dare I say it, slightly more exciting in some ways than it is now. The way that there are now so many indie pattern companies and they have such amazing ranges, you can pretty much imagine any garment, can't you? And there's already a pattern available pretty close, if not exactly like it, isn't there? And I think that I wonder, I don't know, like maybe that's not encouraging creativity in the same way that before it was like, I want a jumper like this, but there isn't anything like, what can I use as a basis? And if you wanted that, you kind of had to work for it a bit more. And now maybe it's all kind of handed to us on a plate slightly more.
Again, handed to those of us who have the internet and the languages that are
disposable
used
income and freedom of time.
Yeah. But when I first learned from the neighbor in Egypt, I should say that my mom just gave me grandma's 1952 Kenmore and showed me how to wind the bobbin and how to put the bobbin in, and then said, okay, go.
There you go. So what age would that have been? How old were you?
I was about 22, I think 22. I was in graduate school. And then I just went. But I didn't know anything about the indie scene. I don't even know if they had it. We're still saying 30 years ago. But I then soon traveled to Egypt again. So this would be, I'd been to Egypt already by that time. And there are village sewists there. There are city sewists and village sewists. Village sewists, even though they're in the city, specialize in the clothing of their particular region.
Oh, really?
You go to them, you get what they make, and that's what their village wears. The women's wear or the men's wear. They make that. And that's how I started to learn that you can't expect that anybody who can sew everything. Mm-hmm. Then I learned about the city sewists who had training in pattern drafting.
Right.
And to a greater or lesser extent, they could look at a picture and draft. Right. I started to learn that they draft for their own bodies in that culture. Right. They draft for those people. A little bit later, I went to Morocco and I saw more of this. Again, we saw village sewing and city sewing, not necessarily named the same. So I was already on the understanding that when you want something, somebody has to draw it. And that somebody could potentially be you. I didn't really learn drafting well until I was in Romania. In Romania, I noticed that people bought Berta magazines. Right. There weren't the pattern envelopes that I had been used to from North America. They bought the Berta magazines, and they then would add seam allowances or tweak here or tweak there. I also think, I had started designing some dresses, and I had designed a wetsuit. With Grandma's 1962 Kenmore, I made a princess pattern for the top from a dress that I had made for me. So I
Yeah.
used that as my basis and traced off the seams. And then I used a quick sew long underwear pattern, which is my favorite long underwear, for the bottom.
Uh-huh.
And I just drafted a wetsuit because they didn't have wetsuits in my size in a 2X. They didn't have women's 2XL in the wetsuit. And I wanted to scuba dive with my friends. I was a licensed scuba diver. I didn't want to wear a men's wetsuit. So I already was, using and doing that. I was never part of that whole indie scene because I didn't understand or know how people were using the internet to share and trade them.
Uh-huh.
The only indie company that I had been following from the beginning is Folkwear.
Right. And I'm so taken with your making your own scuba suit. So that's really like a direct sense that your parents imparted, like, if it's not there, make it. Like, make it happen for yourself. And you're like, of course I'm going to do. So it wasn't the case. I mean, obviously there was probably a sense of frustration linked to not being able to buy exactly what you wanted, but you didn't like, oh, I'm not going to go scuba diving then. You're like, no, let's make this happen.
Right. That sense of frustration is just so small in me about things I cannot get. Because, as you said, I largely think I want to make them. So we also, my husband and I, have the mindset of we'd like to use what we have.
Mm-hmm.
I don't spend much time feeling frustration when the thing I want isn't available because I have the ideas, I have the capability, and I have the economic wherewithal to get my things the way I want them. So where I feel frustration is when I'm interacting with people and they tell me that they're going shopping and I know they have a lot of clothes and shoes already. You can't be like the new evangelist of religion and tell them, no, you have to do that. I mean, if they've come to me to be in my space because of sustainability reasons, they're talking to me on purpose because of that. Yeah. I feel free to ask them, so did you really need another hat? But if they're not, if they're just people that you can't always be down their throat, grabbing their stomach to talk about the environment.
Yeah.
But those are the places that I feel frustration. And I feel frustration sometimes about my own use of resources and inability in the current system to make things better. So I'll tell you a little story.
Please.
So in our Toronto house, we did as much of an energy conservation renovation as we could when we first bought the house, changing 2 radiators from forced air, eliminating the air conditioner. It gets hot in Toronto in the summer, but we don't believe that air conditioning should be used in these latitudes. Stripping out fake finishes and not adding any new ones. And our energy source here is natural gas.
Right.
That's what feeds the houses here. That's what's using, it's not coal. There is electricity and a lot of it's hydroelectricity, but the heat is natural gas.
Right.
So we then hired a consultant to come out so we could get solar. We put a new roof, energy appropriate roof that reflects a lot of the heat. And we wanted to put solar. And we aren't allowed by the electric authority to put enough solar that fills up our roof. And this is why. They looked at our bills. I just told you, we redid everything. We have LEDs everywhere. One of us doesn't see, so he doesn't use lights and electricity. We don't have a TV, and we hang the clothes to dry. We use so little electricity that they then said, we only allow people to put solar panels to no greater than 10% more than the electricity they used average per month in the last year. That's what I said. Really? What kind of nonsense is this? Apparently, they don't want people flooding the grid with electricity and then them having to pay you. Our roof is, and we have a small roof. We have a 3-story house, which means the roof is small compared to the amount of area inside the house.
Sure.
But even the part that we have, only half of it faces south. That could hold, I believe, 18 panels. They say we only use 2 panels worth of solar. So that's all they want to let us build. And we said, well, could we just build more and just give it free? We'll sign a paper that we won't take money for other than what you told us. We can just share. Or we can just give it to the neighbors for free. They said, no, you can't connect it. If you want to build your whole 18 or whatever panels, you could do that, but you have to build your own batteries in your house and connect it. That in these latitudes isn't efficient because you want to give to the grid in the summer and you want to get from the grid in the winter in these northern latitudes in Toronto, Ontario, or even in Vermont. So I'm frustrated that here we have people who are willing and able to put the solar panels and pay the money on it. We don't even care. Just give it to the neighbors.
Yeah.
And they're saying, no, so why don't you just put your two? Well, there's a fixed cost baked into it, whether you have 1 or 1,000 panels. And the startup fixed cost is very high. So when I'm being frustrated about things in relation to the environment, I understand that your broadcast, Check Your Thread, is about sewing. But when I'm saying I'm frustrated about some way in which I'm not able to be effective, so I have 2 vehicles. I could use an electric vehicle if I had some electricity. So then the solar authority said, fine, buy your electric vehicle, buy electricity from us for a year. After that, we'll let you put more panels on.
Right. But then you're going to have to pay that fixed price again?
No, we don't put any, they say don't put any panels on yet.
Okay.
Buy your electric vehicle, buy electricity from us for a year to show us how much electricity you use.
Right.
And then we will let you put on a full array of panels because you will have used more electricity.
You going to go with that?
Well, we still hope to. Our roof is still almost brand new. You don't want to put solar panels on an old roof because when you have to replace your roof, all that has to be carefully taken down.
Sure.
Right. So our roof is still basically new. We are thinking about buying an electric vehicle, but we also are annoyed to have to pay them for a year of their electricity when we could have generated the electricity in the first place. So, we're annoyed right now. Now that I'm going back to work and using a vehicle more frequently to get to work, this is the time for us to think about how much does it turn out we're going to use.
Yeah.
Because what if I still don't use enough electricity to make that worth it? That's the areas about the environment where I feel frustrated. That I would like to do better and you all are interfering with me.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like there is the technology available. You can access it. You are in a position to access it.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there are these things getting in the way, which are just clearly designed to protect the interest of private businesses and their profit and their shareholders. And it's not about improving the environment.
Right. And I also feel a sense of entanglement in it because our ability to do this purchasing, our ability to have spent those years without working, and during the pandemic, my husband wasn't getting gigs. That comes from business having made profit and getting dividends and the increase in the value of holdings that we can then sell. Right. So as much as I can say, point the finger at corporate interests, you're listening to me on a microphone that was bought with money from corporate interests. I can detach. I can make the panties out of an old abaya. I can make the men's underwear out of an old T-shirt. But the sewing machine and the house it's in and all of those things are also part of that capitalist system. Yeah. And so that's another way in which I'm frustrated. Yeah. To say we want to have DIY, that we're all caught up in it to different extents. Yeah. When I was a full-time teacher, I could at least say, I'm working to help the community. I receive money from your tax dollars to teach your kids, and then I use it for my sewing machine and my stuff like that. Yeah. But it's a lot more than that now, and I do feel that very keenly.
Yeah. Oh, that's I'm going to have to sit with that for a while, I think.
I would like to say something that you have been showing a lot of people of color activists on your Check Your Thread podcast, people of color makers. And I'm appreciative that you're using your position as a white appearing person to use your platform to include the people of color in an act of allyship. I also notice you're not necessarily saying that you're being an ally. So I'd like to point out for the people listening to me here that it is allyship to use your platform to enhance the voices of people who are more marginalized, whose voices are less often heard. And I would like to ask you to think about in the future to ask the people if they want to talk about themselves as members of specific communities.
Okay.
I know it's often uncomfortable for people of the majority in power in certain countries to say, oh, so you're fill in the blank. How do you feel? How does that affect your crafting?
Yeah.
You don't want to come off like some kind of a weirdo and some kind of a patronizer. But if you could ask them before if they're willing to talk about it, I would love to have heard how these people see them. And they may not want to go that way, and that's okay. But I would love to have heard how some of them see their activism around their making.
Right.
If they do see any connection to it of their communities of origin. Or if they may not feel, I may be looking at them and saying, oh, you're like me, you're from a marginalized community. And they may not see themselves that way, but I would like to hear more of that if you're willing to talk about that.
Thank you. Thank you. I think I really appreciate what you said. And I am consciously and deliberately trying to make sure that there is a range of people, because I think that the face of the sewing community is often white, middle class, straight, English is their predominant language, thin women. And I want to speak to everybody, and I want to hear a much broader range of opinions and thoughts. But I guess as a white woman, I feel I want to hear from everybody, but I don't want my guests to feel that maybe I've invited them on because I want to specifically extract that conversation from them. Do you know what I mean?
I do, but I think there's a place in you are being an activist to include less heard voices. That's a choice that you're making.
Yeah.
And I don't see anything wrong with asking them how they feel about it. They know if they're in marginalized groups or not.
True.
They don't need, they already were aware. In their posts, they may have said something about that you can hang your hat on to ask them about.
Right.
You know,
okay.
It is uncomfortable sometimes. I'm going to point to a group that I'm not part of, but I've seen how this can work. Persons adopted from countries where the people don't resemble the parents they were adopted to. Okay. They are often mistakenly asked to speak as representatives of said community when in fact they just look like those other people.
Sure.
They don't have the language, they don't have the foodways, they don't have the festivities, they don't have the habits of those other people.
Sure.
So they are like, why are you asking me? And you don't want to be that way to the people, but quite often your makers have said something in their profiles that I would then say maybe you could ask them about. Right. You're not being weird, you're asking them about something that they're saying.
Yeah.
Because it's really important when I look at certain people's accounts and even certain people's books. There's an author who wrote a book about the history of mending.
Right.
And it mostly was about the history of white people mending.
Right.
With very few mentions, very few pages on anything else.
Right.
And I wrote this person, I'm in touch with them on Instagram, and we communicate. And I wrote this person publicly and said, what did you mean when you made this book and you just wrote about the history of really basically white people mending? You spent 2 pages on Africa, you spent this many pages on Europe. They just deleted it.
Really?
We've still maintained communication, but they just deleted it like I never asked it. And so you have a certain...
so offensive. Just to kind of pretend that didn't happen.
Instagram is not the same as having a conversation in your house with your friend.
True.
I would be offended if I were visiting an actual friend in person. I asked her a question and she just said, oh, would you like more tea? That would not be appropriate behavior. But Instagram is curated. Instagram is a presentation of self to the public. And she has chosen to eliminate that comment. She has chosen to excise that sort of dialogue from her feed. I don't necessarily have to be offended. I can just mark when I say, okay, who's an ally and who's not an ally? Who's really just trying to change their world
Mm-hmm.
or who is trying to change the world?
Yeah.
So I point this out to people. And I talk about this. I don't want to call her out by name on this because I think that so many of those people listening have read that book too. And
Mm-hmm.
why didn't they comment? Or has she
Okay.
erased all of our comments? Or is it that they've read it? Because sometimes when I say it to people, they're like, oh my God, yeah, I've got my copy right here. Oh my God. And then they say, oh, I didn't notice. And so I would like those people to have a little time to check it out
Okay.
themselves. Because this is not just about me and her. It's about these listeners and these readers and their critical thinking. You know, we're
Yeah.
teaching these third graders how to make inferences, but some of these grown folks ain't doing it.
Yeah. Critical thinking is something that, as a parent of young children, I'm thinking about all the time at the moment, how to impart that. So,
And what do we think about history? When we think about the history of sewing,
mm,
you have to at least say where you're giving the history of. I'm going
yeah.
to talk about the history from this year to this year of this place. Just mentioning Quebec, next door neighbor to Ontario and to Vermont. So Quebec touches both of my homes.
Mm-hmm.
Quebec had home weaving much later in history than many other parts of the developed world.
Right.
They had vast, vast areas, poor transportation. So the farm wives would have their looms set up. Into the 20th century,
Really?
there were still quite a few, and I meet people from Quebec, and because I'm curious about this, I ask them, did your grandmother have a loom set up?
Yeah.
And quite frequently they say yes, and they're made by Leclerc Looms. Leclerc is still in business. You can go and you can get their looms from them or from dealers throughout the world. They're still there.
Yeah.
Now, it is not common to have a farm wife weaving at home in Quebec, but it is still common enough as a hobby that the company is still in business. And all the
Interesting.
looms they used to sell, you can still buy all the parts for.
Oh,
You can
really?
still renovate your old loom from them.
Yeah.
So there are these pockets where history of home sewing doesn't ever seem to touch, at least in English, doesn't ever seem to discuss that people in Quebec, until around 100 years ago, and in some cases more, were very commonly wearing clothes that their mother or grandmother had woven and sewed.
Wow. That's the fiber shed movement, isn't it?
Yes, yes, it is.
Textiles. Yeah.
And these people, some of these grandmothers are still alive. Some
Yeah.
of those looms are still available. We definitely want to remember that when we're talking about history, it's always talking about who's telling it, where it's being told, and where it's being told about, and the
Yeah.
relationship to what it is we're trying to do today, among other details.
Yeah.
So when I want to think about the history of what I'm doing, I also think about my grandmother who picked cotton in Louisiana
Right.
and made quilts. I have part of an old quilt with her cotton that she
Yeah.
picked, and she made the quilt. She didn't make quilts as a hobby out of new fabric. She made quilts because people were cold in
Right.
her family, and they needed her resources to keep warm. And that was a way to solve a problem that was in their society. That's my history. That's what I'm connected to. It doesn't mean I'm not connected to the Europeans. I speak a European language. I'm communicating with you I don't just speak one, but I'm communicating with you in a language of colonialism that my ancestors in North America learned and speak now, because North America wasn't populated by people who speak English, as we are aware. The European history is, of course, my history too. European art is art that I grew up with, which helped influence the art that has become American art, which has become the aesthetics that we think about. But it isn't just that. I'm also jazz. I'm also blues. I'm also rap. And in terms of sewing, I'm not just the idea of tailors working in guilds to support citified merchants and other people. I'm also the people working in Nigeria and the people making with their narrow looms that you could operate with your hand. That's also me. That's also my history as a maker, even though I myself do not make sitting on the ground with my feet in the hole so that I can weave. That's me too. And I like to think about all of my history as an American and as an African American, not just the European aspects of my history.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's so powerful. Sorry. You've really touched me.
I'm glad that you're open to being touched by frank discussions of history and culture, because, of course, it's a life choice to say, I'm going to see other people, I'm going to listen to them, I'm going to try to think about the world that we all share.
Mm.
And that's a life choice. It's a life choice that I have made to say, why are we here? Well, we're here to help. And I think you've seen me posting, Michael and I, we don't have children. We're still trying all the time to try to get this environmental thing going.
Yeah.
Some of these people do have children. You have children and you're working to try to fix it. Some of these people do have children and they're not doing anything. Well, get on the bus, people.
I know, like literally, it's so obvious.
So it's a choice for me to say, I want the world better. I'm not going to be here. We don't know if it's today. We don't know if it's tomorrow. We don't know how many years it is. There's a day that I'm not going to be here. I believe that the earth will still be here, that people will still be here, and they don't need to be living in nothing but a landfill.
Yeah.
They don't need to have their very bodies contaminated with microplastics because they ate from the oceans that were contaminated from the polyesters that we wore, that we got for $7 on Amazon.
Yeah.
We have to have a better planet for these people.
Yeah.
And so I'm frustrated when I see that governments aren't trying to make this better. I'm frustrated when I see that people are not only some trying not to make it better, but making it worse by coming out with more and more greenwashing, sneaky ways to try to use the desire of the consumer to be better. In the case of some consumers, just a minimal desire. They just want to be a little bit better. And that's being tricked and co-opted into ways that are actually as bad or worse.
Yes. Yeah.
I'd like to cite another podcast that's been very influential to me, and that's the Clothes Horse podcast.
Yes, I've listened to a couple of those. They're amazing, aren't they?
And so, yes, Amanda is out there telling you, stop using plastic, stop giving your money to assholes, and you don't need so much stuff in the first place. And I really get a lot of joy from realizing that I'm not alone in this. You're not alone in this. I've now got almost 1,000 subscribers. People are writing me and saying, well, what do you think about this question? Do you have suggestions? Someone wrote me today. Do you have suggestions on how I can make my own underwear? Because I'm agreeing with you. I want to buy less from factories. Where should I start? Yeah. People are talking to each other, and not all of us are being bought by sponsors and corporations. Again, I said, I can say that I'm unbought, but corporations still paid the bills at the base of this. So let's not start to lie. But I don't have to feel addicted to anyone or other company to say what I feel, because none of them are paying me. And when people have offered me stuff, I've given it back. I don't want your stuff. It's a position that I'm fortunate to be in, but I think more people could also get out there and share what you're doing, because people are doing great stuff.
Yes.
We have a neighbor a couple blocks down, and she's always recruiting from the neighborhood to get used sheets and things for animal shelters. Okay, tell people.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get out there. On the subject of the used stuff, I think you've seen my post where I put out an ad in the Montpelier neighborhood forum. I said, I want your old sheets, towels, bedding, but it has to be damaged, too damaged to donate for somebody. And then I've been taking that and gradually fixing those things up. I also shared the best of it with the refugees that really didn't need any fixing. I'm very sensitive about giving things to people who are in need and making sure that it's better quality than I would want for myself. Because I'm notoriously quite cheap and, use things that were, but better quality to say, we respect you. We're not just giving you something because we have to get rid of it, but because we care about you and we want you to feel welcomed in the things that we're giving you. So I gave some of the best ones to the refugees and have been gradually mending them and sleeping on them and sleeping under them and stuff.
So those posts that you've been posting about the free pile at the thrift store and some of those items that you've been taking, and it's like a whole story. You look into
because why are we posting on the Instagram? What's the goal? The goal is, of course, for people, they're scrolling past. They have a lot they're looking at. They're relaxing by looking at Instagram. And there are also some of them hoping to learn something, hoping to find new ideas. Maybe they're going to find new music, things like that. They're going to make some changes. I've certainly seen some new music and new ideas from Instagram. But it's not enough just to show the people, I have a blanket.
Yeah.
The people have a blanket too. For the most part, again, if they have access to the internet, they don't need pictures of my blanket. They only want pictures of my blanket if there's some relevance.
Yeah.
And again, that's something I learned early in my teaching career. There's no point in just talking if there's no connection to anything in the life of the student. The student doesn't care. Or when you teach vocabulary, it needs to be related to what they're reading or what they're thinking about, what they're doing. It's dead now to just give them vocabulary lists for the week, not connected to anything. And it, in my mind, should be dead to just give pictures of stuff on your Instagram with no connection to the life of the viewers.
Yeah. Yeah. If there's not a story in that caption, I'm not interested. Like, I need to know what's going on. Yeah. I'm just kind of really over these. And I know not everyone's necessarily got the time to fully go into it, but I'm much more interested in, if someone's showing a new project, for example, something that they've made, I want to know, like, what journey did you go on through that? Like, what were your thoughts? What did you learn? Or what went wrong? Or what have you taken from it? Or how do you feel now? And that's the meat and the potatoes that I'm interested in.
And I try to unfollow white people who are taking money from companies.
Right.
I mostly have been able to avoid it. They're sponsored by this fabric company or this sewing machine company or so forth. I don't stop following people of color who are being sponsored by these companies because, frankly, they owe us any damn way. So if they are taking money from corporations, we still ain't got our stuff back anyway, from depending on which cultural group it was getting screwed, could be hundreds of years of servitude. So I still follow those people. As I said, I'm able to make the choice not to take and not to be a sponsor or something like that. And I don't blame them for that. I don't blame the white people. I just don't want to follow them. Like, why do I need your advertisements? There's advertisements on the radio. There's advertisements in the magazines. Why do I need you to be an advertisement for me? I'm not playing with you. I also like to follow people who are going somewhere good. Or this is if there was a train outside and you're like, yeah, that sounds interesting. They're going to, thinking of the People's Mending, who's making homemade mending zines and mending about in their community, or Young Curmudgeon, who mends and sets free garments, mends them and takes them to the food closet and leaves them there and doesn't stand around with a hidden camera to show the oppressed people picking up the clothes that they mended, but just leaves them there.
Yeah. Is that like a food bank?
A food cabinet or a food pantry. So they take a physical structure and put a roof on it so that water or snow won't go inside. And they put a refrigerator sometimes, or sometimes just shelves with a glass door, based on the idea of those book libraries that are
Yes.
free, itty bitty free libraries or something, or people do this for food. They get a shed-like structure that isn't closed so that a crook could hide inside and bother somebody, that has glass doors, or it has no front at all, so you can see if someone's in there, and protect the food and clothing from the elements. And they don't just put food that they don't want. They go out there on purpose and buy bottles of water and put them in there, or whatever it is according to their ability, and cook meals specifically to be placed in there and wrap them and date them. And then people come along who want or need those items and get them. So what Young Curmudgeon is doing, Young_Curmudgeon is doing, YUNG, is going and finding clothes that are too damaged to donate in the condition they are in, sewing and repairing those, and setting them free by putting them in these pantries.
Yeah.
And people are taking them.
That's amazing.
And trying to see that also Young Curmudgeon could do this in silence and not tell us.
Yeah.
But they are offering an example so more of us can think, oh, yeah, that's a train I want to be on.
Yeah.
That's how I
want to be on that train.
Okay, too. That's how I can learn and how I can be better.
Yeah.
So those are the people that I like to follow. I also like to follow some that are just amusing and they're just for fun and they have nothing to do with being better.
Yeah.
But I generally prefer an Instagram feed that's uplifting to growing to be better.
Yeah.
We can make our own uplifting content and we can search it out. But anyway, thank you so much. This has been really fun, and I'm looking forward to listening. I cannot thank you enough.
This is incredible. Thank you. Thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and are left feeling inspired. For more info about the podcast, including show notes for this and every episode, head to checkyourthread.com. I'd love to hear from you, so if you have any comments, questions, or ideas for future episodes, please get in touch by emailing zoe@checkyourthread.com or find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. Massive thanks to Patrick Potter for production support, to Sylvia Seller for the awesome logo design, and to Simon at Palm Skin Productions for the music. This ad-free podcast would not be possible without listener support, so if you feel you are able, please consider signing up to the Check Your Thread Patreon. For the equivalent of buying me a coffee each month, you'll be making it possible to continue producing regular episodes. Links can be found in the show notes and on the website checkyourthread.com. I hope you'll listen again next week. Until then, take care. Bye!